Chapter 45, Stormfront. Stormfront. They reached Al-Hali at sunset. Solafane had first spotted it hours ago, and since then it had been slowly rising from the horizon with their approach, a solitary outline of black upon bloody plains, the land stained red under the sinking sun. And always beside them, but a few hundred yards across the grasslands they walked, that meandering wall of black trunks, the dark belly of some verdant snake, the Apogis and all its secrets was waiting for them. For hours, the town had seemed to grow no closer, and Frithha had even considered they might not reach the place before nightfall. And then, all at once, they were there, standing on the edge of where dried, yellow grass finally gave way to packed earth, the plains worn away by the attrition of feet that would never walk there again. Frithha wondered how long it would be before the grasslands claimed the place once more. Al-Hali was deserted, and yet there was something more than a mere lack of people. It was as though even the spirit of the place had gone. The buildings before them were empty, smoke-blackened shells where they had been set ablaze, the packed earth streets and walls stained here and there in a dark russet Frithha had seen all too many times. Murmured prayers behind her, Frithha was unable to manage even that, and she merely stood there, staring across the desolate vista and taking in every monstrous detail, choked by the idea that some decision she had made in a distant place and time had allowed such horrors. She did not know when she had begun to tremble, only that she was now, body quivering with an anger it was not large enough to contain. That there were men in the world who could inflict such atrocities upon another. Perhaps the murder whose divinity she was soon to embody was not so terrible, she certainly felt she could take great pleasure in it then. "You did not do this," murmured a no-man at her back, taking her shaking for fear or sorrow and placing a firm hand upon her shoulder. Frithha fought the urge to shove him back and instead set out to distance herself from the needling contact that had stirred up her bile. "Come, we should scout the area before nightfall." They moved as a group along the main street. A square had been left open in the settlement's center and it was there they split up, Imoen at her side as she had been those last few days, though whether it had been Frithha's tears before Halzik or her fight with Valigar after it which had brought Imoen there, Frithha still did not know. Al-Hali was either a large village or a small town, expanding into the plains over the years as was needed. It was certainly large enough that they could lose the others after a street or two. Frithha moved along the wide lane with Imoen, not wanting to see but feeling compelled to look at the charred shutters of gutted homes, dust blown across yawning doorways and the smell of decay wafting from the buildings with the buzz of flies. They saw no bodies though, merely darker stains on the ground where they had been cut down, the dusty streets pocked by a chaos of hoof and footprints likely belonging to the soldiers who had cleared them. At the end of the lane, the grass of the plains swayed in serene ignorance around a large square of freshly tilled earth. Frithha led them right up to the edge. It had no marker, but she knew what it was. "A mass grave," said Imoen bleakly. Frithha wondered if she had been hoping for survivors. "Whoever came here after the mercs likely ordered it dug. The ground would have had to be consecrated and the bodies blessed to ensure they did not rise again." Frithha turned away, her gaze back on the settlement behind her, and she had reached for her flask without thinking, the mixed liquids within warm and sour. Imoen sighed, nodding to the canteen as she lowered it. "Here, let's have some of that. I drank all my water this afternoon." Frithha suppressed the instant urge to lob the flask as far as she could into the plains. "Ah, best not. I think I might have a cold coming on." "What? Don't be daft. The quarters we live in, whatever you get I'll likely catch anyway." The girl had her hand out expectantly. Frithha sighed and passed the flask to her, watching as Imoen raised it for a swig and coughed over the mouthful. "Bloody hells! What's in here?"
A mixture of a strawberry wine I found at that abandoned farm we stayed in a very rough port I bought from those travelers we met 2 days back. I'm not drunk.
Frithha sighed, smiling absently as she recalled a similar declaration from long ago.
It's just something to take the edge off. Frithha, this. You shouldn't. Well, I am.
Frithha snorted, shoving the flask bag into her back to catch Imoen with a hard look.
Now we've both got a secret.
Imoen opened her mouth, more than ready to take great umbrage at the comparison, but another's shouts cut her off. After so long, Frithha felt attuned to his voice.
Cellophane.
The shouting was close, but hard to pinpoint, echoing against the empty buildings. Frithha tore down the street in a cloud of dust. At the end, Cellophane had just staggered into view, sword drawn, but held back, his free hand locked about a ragged youth and struggling to hold him back without allowing injury to either of them as the child thrashed and punched at any part of the drow he could reach.
You did this. I'll. Scylla.
He turned at the cry, the boy managing to land a punch to his stomach that likely more surprised than hurt the man, though the ingrained reaction could not be caught in time. The sword was dropped, Cellophane's freed hand swinging in to snatch the boy's arms and hoist him to his toes. A shriek split the air like a hawk's cry.
Leave him alone.
A girl had streaked from the abandoned building just behind to barrel bodily into the drow, her small fists pummeling anything she could reach as Cellophane struggled to hold them both.
Let him go. Get off me. You're with them. I'll.
Frithha grabbed the boy's collar to haul him about, the young girl dancing back from Cellophane in her surprise.
You'll what?
Frithha demanded, stooped and snarling, her face but an inch from his. All the fight seemed to leave him and he was just a child again, grubby, gaunt and utterly broken. A hand at her shoulder, Imoen's voice was unusually soft.
Frithha, he's just a kid.
Frithha released him to stand beside the girl, both bedraggled and wary, glowering up at her from beneath unkempt dark hair. They were of a similar age, about 12 years old and of the local coloring, their plain linen kurtas stained with sweat and dust.
Not one step, either of you,
she muttered, turning from the pair to spare a glance to Cellophane, the man sending her a nod as he sheathed his blade. The thunder of footsteps behind them, Valigar pounding around the corner with Minsk, Jahara, and Anomen.
Imoen, what had hap, children? Helm's mercy.
Jahara crouched before the pair.
What are your names? Don't tell her, Palonna,
cried the boy, his face crumpling to a wince as soon as the words left his mouth. The girl just sighed, sweeping her long ratty braid over her shoulder.
I'm Palonna and this is Harit. Is it only you here?
Continued Jahara. The pair shared a glance and nodded.
Did you see what happened?
Asked Frithha. Harit squared narrow shoulders to the question.
Men came.
A nod to Cellophane.
Some were like him. Where?
Pressed Frithha. She could likely guess, but they needed to build an alliance through shared action.
Show me where they came from.
They followed the children to the other side of the settlement where the plains began again for barely 50 yards, leading straight into the black shadow of those looming trees and the flattened path through them which was obvious even from that distance, as though they were daring anyone to follow. Frithha gazed past it, deep into the forest's gloom. There was something about Apogis. It was not like the Wieldeth, parched and brittle, only ever a lighting strike away from fire. But it was little like the swampy mangroves of the mere either, all droning insects and stagnant water. The Apagis felt aware, as though the forest itself was watching them, waiting to see what they would do and how it would be forced to react.
"We had just sat down to supper,"
began Harriet, his eyes distant as he stared into the trees as she had been, as though recalling some vague memory from long ago.
"There was shouting and screams from outside. Pa went out into the street, he didn't come back. Ma sent me out the back door, told me to run into the fields. I met Palonna, it had been the same for her. There were other kids, too,"
the girl explained,
"hiding in the grass. Someone shouted to head for Gujert, the next village over, but my brother, Faran, had been out in the cowshed. I needed to find him. Palonna and me went back. Our street was on fire. The men were rounding up the animals and—"
the boy gulped over the words,
"and some of the people. They were taking orders from ones like you."
Cellophane straightened, but did not turn from the boy's glare.
"We hid and waited until they were gone." "But why didn't you try to get to Gujert or tell the knights you were here when they came?"
asked Imoen. The pair shrugged, Harriet adding tonelessly,
"This is our home. We're all that's left." "Not all,"
corrected Valigar.
"We met some merchants on the road from Al-Hali who had been away from the town when the attack came. They were heading east."
A sudden hope lit Palonna's round face.
"Uncle Tevan was out when the attack came. Perhaps we should go look for them." "No!"
cried Harriet, glowering at her in this betrayal.
"The lad is right,"
agreed Jahara.
"We do not know where they will be headed and that distance would be dangerous to travel alone. But, you are correct as well, Palonna, you cannot remain here." "Yes, we can,"
yelled Harriet.
"There is food in some of the houses and the well has water. It is not safe."
The boy would not hear it.
"I'm not leaving,"
he shrieked, suddenly wild.
"I'm not leaving till Ma. I saw them take her. She's alive. If we leave and she comes back, don't touch me."
A small fist lashed out, Jahara darting back and snatching his arm as he made to flee once more.
Get off me." "Harriet, stop. That's why we've come."
Firtha's voice was steady, cold even, cutting through the escalating tempers.
"We're going to get them back, Harriet, everyone they took, everyone that we can. But we need to know you're safe before we go." "Harriet, please,"
ventured Palonna quietly,
"they're right." "Fine,"
he muttered at last, wrenching away from Jahara to mop sullenly at his face with a torn sleeve. Firtha nodded once.
"You must leave here, and go to Halsik,"
provided Anomen.
"It will take only a day by the main road. Once in the town, head for the shrine to Torm and ask for Sir Caudrel. He is a friend of mine. He will help you." "You should remain here tonight though,"
added Jahara, turning to usher the pair before her.
"Come, you can take a meal with us."
They made camp in the dust of the main square. No one had wanted to stay in any of the houses. Harriet and Palonna huddled on the other side of the fire, sharing a warm flatbread. Firtha could not look at them, and even the sharp contents of her flask could not ease the nauseating guilt. Her decision had cost this, had left them and countless others without parents, destroyed families and lives. The world had put their deaths at her feet and there was nothing she could do. She couldn't set it right. She couldn't make it better. All she could do was take retribution. In the pit of her stomach, the blood purred. Cellophane kept low in amongst the ferns, body pressed to the bank that rose another foot or so above the brim of his hat. The sound of breathing marked Valigar's presence in the ferns somewhere to his left, though it was almost lost to the shouts and steady strike of tools that echoed up from the gully just over the rise. After 8 days in the forest, they had found it. They had entered the Apogis the morning after reaching Alhali, Herat and Palonna, given enough coin and food to last the day before being set upon the road for Halzik. Their own company had set out on a different path, following the clear trail that had been left through the undergrowth, and it was as the dusk was falling they finally came upon a campsite, deep within the forest and long since packed up in a trap that the mercenaries had seemingly grown bored of waiting to be sprung. They had camped the night there, in what little cover they could find, and the following day found them picking the most promising trail to follow it southeast, deeper into the forests. The trail had gone cold only a day later though, and for 2 more days they wandered one hopeless trail after another until a crash of rubble from somewhere over the rise above them, angry shouting mingled with the cries of some unfortunate who was taking the blame in a beating. Slowly, Solafane crept further up the bank, the stirring ferns next to him indicating Valigar was attempting the same. 2 days ago, Minsk had returned late from a hunt to tell of an outrider he had seen leading his horse back through the forest, the tracks it had left still fresh the morning after, and now there they were. He inched his body further up the bank, ignoring the irritating bristle of the fern stalks and the dead leaves that were gathering in his belt. He had first heard the encampment an hour ago, whispering on the edge the forest's serenity like a distant storm, and he and Valigar had been creeping closer ever since. The ridge was just above him now, the ferns coming to an abrupt end as the bank fell away in a rocky escarpment. The shallow gully it dropped down to was too large to be natural, the clearing at least the size of Dynagate's market square and ringed by cliffs slightly taller than a man, the once thick carpet of moss and ferns more recently cleared back to the dirt by the insistent tramp of countless feet. Directly opposite them, a fissure split the opposite rock face. It appeared to have been made much wider by recent digging, a steady stream of broken men and the occasional woman pushing barrows full of stone from the yawning hole, all under the watchful eyes of their mercenary guards. The reason for this excavation was set to their right, an ancient building rising in dark, lichen-encrusted sandstone over 2 floors to dominate a good half of the clearing. A narrow tower rose above the main building for another 3 stories, the wood of recently restored main doors looking fresh and incongruous in their ancient stone frame. It seemed to Solafane like some combination of fort and temple. The thick stone walls were set with narrow, defendable windows, the tower summit crenulated, while the whole building was encircled by a high stone wall. But for its clearly martial function, every lintel, frame, and keystone was covered in carvings, symbols and scenes of a faith he suspected had long since been forgotten from the state of disrepair. All over the walls and building, bright yellow patches of freshly quarried sandstone showed where repairs had been made, and a whole team of slaves worked still to mend a breach in the rear of the walls, while at the front gates. Solafane felt his nostrils twitch, the only outward sign of the myriad of emotions that churned within as he watched 2 fellow drow in discussion before the gateway. That they were out in the light, albeit muted by the trees, without veil or shade for their eyes, meant they had likely been there a few months at least. For a moment, Solafane just watched them, the rest of the camp fading away. The way they moved, so fluid and sharp, seemed familiar and yet all at once alien to him. Even the subtle posturing in their exchange, the ever-present vying for an advantage over one's fellows that had once been as familiar to his state of being as drawing breath, now looked complex and pointless, and he was struck by the idea that even if he had desired to return to the Underdark, it may have no longer been possible for him. To the left of the clearing and opposite the temple, 4 large pavilions and a scattering of smaller tents had been pitched, soldiers in a mix of blue and green livery milling about the cooking fires. Solafane counted little more than 20 men, though hardly the numbers Sendai was reputed to have gathered by now. The thought had him inexplicably worried. At his side, Valigar was moving through the ferns, retreating back from the bank, and Solafane followed him, the pair reconvening behind the rotting trunk of a fallen tree at the foot of the embankment.
So that was why they've been raiding villages,
the ranger murmured.
for slaves to mine and repair that temple. I do not see many here for all who are supposed to be missing,
offers Solifane grimly.
Perhaps they are underground at the rock face. Or perhaps the mercenaries go through them quickly. That temple. Why would she bother to restore it, unless... We need to get closer, we've nothing useful yet to take back to the others. We help no one if we are seen.
A blithe whistling cut their argument dead. Behind them a youth in the dark green of a local merc band was strolling along the foot of the embankment on a cheerful patrol of the perimeter. Solifane tensed, ready to leap up as the youth set to pass right next to the trunk they were crouched behind. But just before he reached them, the youth turned sharply, wading through the ferns back towards the forest proper to stand before a nearby tree. The sound of falling water pattered the bouncing ferns, they could not have asked for a better distraction. Solifane slipped a hand into his bag and pointedly withdrew a coil of rope. Valigar nodded once, the man rising to a half-crouch to circle about into the trees before the lad as Solifane stepped up behind. The youth noticed neither of them, head down and fingers fumbling with the ties at his breeches. The drow drew a breath and...
Surfacer!
The lad whipped round with a start.
Wah! Shit! Don't sneak Ugn!
A large, swarthy hand muffled the rest, the boy's eyes wide as Valigar was suddenly behind him, one hand clamped over his mouth while the other arm was fast about his waist. He began to struggle, Solifane was ready for him, the boy brought double by a sharp punch to stomach, and the rope was bound about his wrists before he had even chance to pull them back. Solifane was already crouched and binding his ankles similarly, Valigar fastening a strip of linen about his mouth and, as soon as it had begun, it was over. Valigar had the boy's weight, the youth laid gently to the ground beneath them. He did not make a noise, did not even struggle. He seemed too shocked to react and just started up at them breathing heavily, eyes wide over his bleeding nose, like a hind waiting for the knife.
Come,
said Valigar, making a quick check of the ropes before heaving the youth up over his shoulder with a grunt.
We should get back.
It had been Minsk who had found it, 4 days ago on one of his scouts further into the forest. The hollow was at least 5 yards across, left by an uprooted tree that was now slowly decaying to mulch, and it had not taken long for them to cover the hole with their tarp. The pegs had sunk easily into the peaty earth, that pale expanse of canvas strewn with leaves and dirt until it had merged seamlessly with the forest floor. Inside, it was muddy, dark, and crawling with insects and worms that coiled helplessly from the earthen walls. And, for the last 4 days, it had been their home as they had searched the surrounding forests in vain. But that morning, Solifane and Valigar were still out, following the trail of the outrider Minsk had first seen the night before, and the sense of anticipation over those they had left was palpable. Minsk and Imoen were chatting quietly, a growing pile of soft grey pelts between them as they skinned their catches from the squirrel traps that been their main source of food since entering the forest, while a Nomen was already inside the dugout and likely tending the fire that was to cook them from the thin tendril of smoke that was curling from the entryway. On the far edge of the clearing, Frithha was rooting in the earth with her hands, digging out a few more of the jicama tubers they had found the day before. She looked strangely at home there, and not just for the fact she was as filthy and wayworn as the rest of them. The girl no longer seemed to set herself outside her surroundings, still trying to keep that air of civilization about her. She was part of that place now, wearing its mud as she had once worn her henna, the dirt smudged across her face to blend with the dark kohl rims she still painted under her eyes. Frithha had dispensed with her hat before they had even entered the forest, the girl braiding back the hair from forehead to gather up and pin the rest at her crown, and she had not taken it down since. Perhaps it was the lack of curls at her temples to soften it, or the lingering gauntness to her features since her 10 days of being starved at that camp, but the druid fancied she held a predatory look. Something about her manner had changed since Alhali, too, though she would not speak of it. In fact, she hardly spoke at all, just stared into the trees, listening to sounds even Jahara could not seem to pick out from the hissing canopy. The girl caught her watching to send her a nod, abandoning her task and closing the few paces between them.
They've been gone a while now. Perhaps, but I do not see any reason to worry yet.
I'm not worried, Fritha murmured, head cocked as she assessed the rolling sough of the trees.
All will come, in time.
Jahara joined her in a sigh. She wished sometimes the girl had not been forced into that role at so young an age. To the east, the crash of undergrowth swelled to join the rustling air.
Quickly!
But Jahara's urging was redundant. Imoen and Minsk diving instantly into the dugout, much to Anomen's surprise. Fritha was already concealed in a nearby clump of ferns and the druid found a place just behind her. Her shallow breathing stirred the delicate fronds, eyes fixed on the eastern approach, and the druid parted the foliage to see, at last, two familiar shapes.
It is all right,
she sighed, relief leaving her breathless as she made to rise.
It is them.
And they were not alone.
They've made a friend,
quipped Imoen, though not even she was not smiling. Valigar was panting, tired by his burden, the group shuffling back in anticipation of the body he dumped at their feet, and they were suddenly all staring down at youth of no more than 20 summers, short sandy hair looking almost white against his tanned skin. His nose was slightly swollen, an injury from his abduction no doubt, though it had long ago stopped bleeding, blood dried to a red crust that trailed from lip to chin, and with eyes bulging and spittle foaming about the gag at his mouth, he looked almost rabid. Fritha fell to a crouch next to him. They made for a strange scene, a girl and boy who, in another time and place, could have met at some harvest fete, could have even shared a dance. Fritha had reached a pale, grubby finger forward to unhook the gag, the boy spitting a few times to clear the blood from his mouth before finally finding his voice.
Who are you? We are here from Alhali.
He groaned, wretched and low, the youth squirming pitifully against his bonds.
Oh, gods! Please, I never.
Fritha would not let him finish the excuses.
You will tell us what we need to know.
She straightened, glancing to the two men opposite. Solifane began.
Where is Sendai? Sendai?
The boy croaked, seeming amazed they even knew the name.
She stays in that building, the old temple. So she is on the surface. Yeah,
the boy nodded quickly.
She lives at the temple, well, part of it anyway. The place was a ruin when we first arrived, only the tower is livable even now. And she goes into the tunnels sometimes too, to check on the soldiers and the other slaves. There are others,
prompted Valigar.
Yeah, the rest of her army. These dark-skinned dwarfs and more drow. The merc bands stay on the surface, but the others prefer it in the caverns. What caverns are these?
Asked Jahara. Wide eyes found her in the sea of faces above him.
The caverns? You don't know? The temple, one of the elves from the Onferal's hand said it was built to guard the entrance. Down there's this great split in the rock, and if you walk down far enough, the Underdark. That's where her army came from. Sendai, she brought it with her. Not all, reminded Fritha, she has mercenaries on the surface.
Another glance to the two scouts.
Did you see all of them there? No,
offered Valigar.
Barely 30 men over 2 factions to keep the slaves in line. Where are the others, boy? All over. They're in encampments all over the forest. They keep moving, sometimes venture out for supplies. You mean to sack the nearby villages?
Snapped Anomen. It seemed as though Fritha had had the same thought from her scowl.
How many of you are there? I don't know. About 300-400 men over 200 different companies. But add in those Sendai keeps under the ground and her army could reach 1,000.
A muttering of oaths to which Jahara added a soft plea to Sylvanus. If this army marched below them, the youth seemed to sense he was drawing to the end of his interrogation.
Please, that's all I know. Now, please, let me go. And have you running back to tell your brothers?
Asked Fritha. The boy drew his own conclusions from her question, suddenly thrashing frantically in the dirt and leaves, sobbing like a child.
Please, you can't, have mercy. Mercy, is it? And how many cries of that did you hear in Al-Hali?
The boy could make no reply, too lost in his own wretchedness.
What are we going to do with him?
Asked Imoen quietly. No one answered her, at first. Fritha was staring down at the boy, blood and mucus congealing in the stubble on his chin. The silence about them seemed very loud.
Go inside.
Solophane's throat bobbed.
Fritha, I can.
But the girl shook her head, and Jahara felt it all through her chest, that pang of rueful pride. It would have been too easy to stand back and give the order to another. For a moment, the druid thought one of them would check the girl, but no one did, the group filing past to step down into that cool dark pit, the desperate sobs of the boy but a canvas bred the way.
No, please, I only wanted, my mother said, please, she has no one else, and, oh, sweet Ilmater, please, I beg you, no.
Silence and then the soft thud of footsteps, Fritha dropping into the dugout to face her jury.
You killed him,
breathed Imoen. For a moment she sounded like the frightened young woman she was. Fritha did not flinch from it.
He knew of our presence here and our location. Do you want to set out in this knowing we leave such a liability behind us? We could have kept him tied up, incapacitated. No means of that is infallible. You would weight his life against all our own and the thousands we set out to save. You saw Al-Hali, you know what's at stake here. As it is,
Fritha continued, all brisk interest for the task at hand,
it will not be long before they notice one of their guards is missing. We must move quickly. Thoughts?
She had turned instinctively to Solophane and Valigar, the two men sharing a glance for the former to offer.
Though there is a wall about the temple, I noted a small work party of slaves and guards repairing a collapse at the back. The way to it is covered by dense trees. It could be a way to breach the temple without attracting too much attention.
Fritha nodded, seemingly considering the advantage.
Right then, how about this? We'll rush the work party at the rear of the temple, killing the guards and freeing the few slaves who are there. Before the other guards can rally, we'll get inside the temple and bar the doors. Jahara, Anomen, Valigar, and Imoen will hold the entrance, while Minsk, Solophane and I head up the tower and kill Sendai and her guards. And then,
demanded Imoen,
we will be trapped in the temple with a whole army amassing outside. The proof of Sendai's body will remove the mercs and possibly the drow, too,
Fritha concluded succinctly.
And if there are more guards within the temple,
added Valigar.
Why would there be any more than a handful? The place is under repairs.
Jahara was frowning.
You seem to be rather relying on the idea that Sendai is even there. She is just as Abizigal was at his stronghold.
Frithha breathed a terse sigh.
He was, eventually. All right, then.
The girl continued, she could clearly see opinion was stacked against her.
How about a couple of us sneak inside? That leaves the rest of us out here and ready should something go amiss. I could likely get in unseen.
No, interrupted Jahara. Dark-rimmed eyes snapped to her.
What's wrong now?
Frithha, the druid sighed, reluctant to voice words that should have been said a long while ago.
You are our leader. You cannot keep placing yourself in danger like this. You need to remain outside, to give orders should something go awry. Trust in us. Because that worked out so well last time. Besides, it needs to be me, the fates. Oh, not this again!
Cried Imoen.
The fates you're so happy to rely on have done nothing but steer us wrong since we left Suldanissellar.
Frithha snorted.
Perhaps you have dreamt some revelation recently that will help us then. You!
Breathed Imoen, the instinctive insult just bitten back.
You know I've had the same useless dreams since Amkithran. Yes, and I wonder who you think sends it. You can likely make a better guess at that than Imoen,
snapped Valigar.
It is clear you know more of this than you are willing to share. I know that Sendai is within that temple.
Jahara took her cue to interject.
Frithha, whether the fates are with us or not is beside the point. Leaders are supposed to be the backbone of a group. They need to be giving orders and trusting their people, not going into danger alone. You wish to make the decisions for this group still? Then you must lead us. And how can she lead?
Offered Solafane coolly,
when all you do is doubt her. Expressing reservations as to a plan is not disloyalty.
Snapped Anomen.
No.
The drow inquired.
I suppose there were many knight commanders in the order to whom you often expressed similar doubts. That is different. Yeah, they have an obligation to keep their people alive. Imoen, that is unfair.
Frithha had drawn back from the squabble, gazed focused on her twitching fingers. Jahara could sense the building frustration.
Frithha, understand, this is not against you.
Too late the cry.
Fine.
The girl snapped.
If it cannot be me.
She turned grave eyes upon the man opposite.
Solafane, you will enter the temple and stealth and assassinate Sendai.
Silence. Solafane eased back as he came to terms with the honor for which he had been singled out.
Yes, I should imagine that is possible. If she is not there,
the girl added tartly,
you may leave the same way and none will be the wiser. And what of the rest of her army?
Asked Valigar.
Without any to pay them, the mercenaries will likely disband. Any who do not, will be routed by the army in time. As for those below the surface.
Frithha glanced to Solafane, the voice of his fellow Underdarkers.
The temple proves the entrance has been here for hundreds of years. If the drow had wished to invade then they would have done so an age ago. I doubt there is anything nearby enough to interest them. As a precaution, we could let the Silver Chalice know of the temple's location and they can likely reinscribe any wards,
added Anomen. A round of nodding, Solafane looking both nervous and resolute as he turned back to Frithha.
So, I am to go then? Now. Yes, now,
the girl agreed with a decidedly false smile.
But not alone. Imoen will go, as well, under the guise of your slave. With your skills and what Imoen's been getting up to lately, you should be covered for all eventualities. Sure,
said Imoen tightly,
piece of cake.
For an instant, the dugout was silent as the pair glared at each other. Valigar's forehead was creased with the usual frown.
And what are we to do in the meantime? We will prepare the area for your escape,
Frithia continued to the pair.
After you enter, we will give you a quarter hour, then begin a distraction, something easy to explain away, a fire perhaps, or something else. That should ensure the camp is distracted from the temple long enough for you to act and leave unnoticed. Any questions?
The mercenary camp was a tranquil scene of gentle bustle in the early afternoon. The majority of the men gathered about the scattering of smaller tents. Imoen kept focused on the swinging ponytail of white hair a few paces before her, fighting the constant temptation to scan the trees to their left for the others she knew were sneaking along the perimeter towards the grouped pavilions. Though they had never officially fallen out, the impending danger had seen her and Valigar snatch a few moments' privacy back at the dugout, and any lingering resentment between them was now finally let go. There was something to be said for that life of near constant peril. It certainly put any lover's quarrels into perspective. Solifane had reached the rough trail that had been worn into the main approach, the man turning onto the open pathway through the cleared ferns to stroll into the camp, heading directly for the large temple to the right. Imoen felt increasingly twitchy as the few mercs about glanced up to note their passing, her heart tripping along in time to her hurried passage.
Sola, is this safe? I mean, us just walking in like this. Who will stop us?
The man murmured back.
I imagine all drow look the same to the mercenaries. Just keep your head lowered and you should remain beneath their notice, too. You are my slave, remember.
She snorted, but kept her chin dipped.
How could I forget? Do you honestly think this will work? Yes, I do. If you do not, then why are you here?
Imoen merely sighed.
You always agree with Frithia.
She sensed rather than watched the thoughtful pause.
I believe in her,
he offered eventually.
One day the rest of you will have the same confidence.
Imoen wanted to add that she'd have a whole lot more confidence if she hadn't found out Frithia was carrying the equivalent of industrial-grade rum in her flask, but they had reached the gateway. Imoen kept her head down, Solifane marching through without a glance to either of the mercs who were chatting just to one side of the opening, and for their part they hardly noted him. Inside the shelter of the walls, it was but a few yards to the steps, the worn sandstone stairs leading up to those pale wooden doors. A single sharp heave to draw one back, and she was ushered into the gloom beyond. Imoen heard the door slam shut behind, and released a breath she had not realized she'd been holding. They were in a small entrance hall, the open square barely any larger than the two corridors that led off from either side of it, another set of new wooden doors barring the way forward. It smelled fusty and cool, the air of ruin lingering about the place still despite the recent renovations. The walls inside were the same smooth sandstone, brackets set high above where wall hangings and tapestries once kept the chill from the air. Along the leftmost corridor, the distant sounds of a work crew echoed, the chime of chisels muted by murmuring voices. Solifane did not even look at the door before them, the drow glancing back and forth along the two corridors before nodding to the rightmost passage.
Come, from the position of the tower outside, I believe the entrance will be this way. Have you done this before?
Imoen whispered as they set out, their footsteps scuffing softly over the flagstones.
Assassinated anyone, I mean? Yes, a few times. Feyre knew such tasks were an affront. A true warrior should be able to stand before their enemy and take pride in a kill, not sneak about like some craven cave rat. I was the best male fighter in the city. The insult to even ask me when her house had assassins already trained and devoted to such an art was great, and I was proud enough back then to let it needle me. And now?
Pressed Imoen. She watched his shoulders bob.
And now I see the need of such methods and their advantages. What Frithia asks of us is a compliment to the skills she attributes to us.
Imoen rolled her eyes. When it came to Frithia, Solafane could likely find a compliment in a slap to the face.
Yeah, I'm honored.
They walked the rest of the hallway in brisk silence. The corridor seemed to run the perimeter of the lower floor, Solafane leading them past a few doorways to pause at the first corner, a glance around confirming the adjoining passage, too, was empty. Half the length of the building again, and they soon found themselves before a single, large door. He leaned in, an ear cocked to the wood, before he stepped back to draw his sword. Imoen tensed, ready for whatever was to come. Solafane raised a fist and knocked twice, barking something in his own tongue. A smooth run of clicks as the latch turned, the door barely ajar when Solafane thrust his blade through the gap. She had been ready for it, but even so, the suddenness of the kill took Imoen by surprise. Solafane was already through the door and heaving the body of the dead drow further inside to dump him, crumpled over the first few steps of the flight that rose straight above them, golden in the light that streamed through the narrow windows of the first landing. Someone had taken the trouble to lay a carpet here, the rich wine red doing well to cover the pooling blood, banners of black and gold hanging at regular intervals all up the stairwell bearing an insignia of entwined snakes, the flags bright against the pale cream stone. Solafane sent her a firm nod and set foot on the first step. There was no going back now. Frithia kept low in the ferns, the presence of others gathering behind her whispering on the edge of her senses. The mercenary pavilions had been pitched close to the cliff that ringed the entire encampment, the tall tents casting the thicket they were crouched within in shadow. The largest of the tents was just before them, two smaller pavilions pitched further into the camp proper, while beyond them, the scattered grouping of smaller tents and campfires that Frithia could hear rather than see, the shouts and laughter sounding loud even from that distance. And above the peaked canvas roofs it rose, the pale sandstone tower where all their futures lay. Frithia could feel her there, a pulse that quivered through her limbs and down to the ends of her twitching fingers. Sendai. She should be meeting the woman face to face, she should be the one to strike the final blow. But the others had disagreed and, though it had gone against every drop of her raging blood, Frithia had sent another to take her place. She clenched her nervous fingers, trying to will the tremor from them. Perhaps this course was the wisest. The blood had been getting louder of late, ever since Alhali and the awakening desire to see her revenge wrought upon an unjust world. It was hard to fight it, harder still when even the forest seemed to be with her. Trees that had once loomed imposing, now stood as her protection. If the forest did have an awareness of its own, it was no longer her enemy. The earth hid her, the trees towered as her allies, as though the place knew her purpose there. The Apagis wanted these interlopers gone and Frithia was more than ready to oblige it.
Right,
hissed Jahara behind her.
It is agreed one of us will put on the boy's tabard and take position somewhere in the camp. Once the time comes for the distraction, he can cause a disturbance, and under this cover we can extract Imoen and Solafane and escape unheeded into the forest. Who will enter the camp then?
Asked Frithia. Valigar opened his mouth to volunteer, he never got the chance.
I will go,
said Inomen. Jahara looked skeptical, and Frithia would have once agreed with her. But there was an anger in Inomen now, and when it was not directed at her, she could see a definite advantage to it.
Yes, I second that, Inomen will do well, and after 6 days in the forest you rather look the part, too.
The man took the compliment as it was meant and even managed a smile for her through that scrubby beard, though Frithia's attention did not linger to see it, her eyes back on the camp. Behind her, Jahara helped him on with the grubby tabard, Minsk and Valigar muttering some final words of advice, and Frithia did not see Inomen again before he left them, all her focus on the nearest pavilion.
There,
hissed Valigar, gesturing to the narrow gap left between the tent before them and the shallow sandstone cliff.
"We can strike easily from behind there if needed."
One by one they crawled through the ferns to drop neatly over the edge of the escarpment into the gloom beneath, and barely a moment later they were gathered again. The ground between the taut guy ropes was still springy with moss, their footfalls stirring the peaty scent as they pressed together, the cliff face at their backs and the pale wall of the pavilion throwing its shadow over all. There were people inside the tent, the sounds of movement and scent of cooking betrayed them, and through the plain canvas Frithha could see the faint outline of two men seated just before where they had come to stand, their voices muffled but quite audible through the heavy fabric.
"Oi, Jesson, 2 more ales here, woman. She's got a body that one, I tell you. Shame about that limp though. What's it matter to you? It's not like you want her anywhere but on her back."
Crude laughter held them. Frithha's hands were twitching, blood screaming for her divine judgment, just as she had looked upon Al-Hali, just as she had stared down at that snivelling mercenary whelp.
"Besides, she's not as fine as that Calandra. Nah, I had her once when she first arrived. Cried the entire time, it well put me off, fucking."
Everything felt suddenly distant, as though she were in a dream, and Frithha could only imagine the man's horror as the blood spattered his face, the canvas behind his companion's head suddenly sliced open and 2 grubby hands reached through to haul back his friend's head and slit his throat.
"Shit! Men, ugh!"
What little cry he had managed was silenced by the katana now skewering his chest, Valigar withdrawing the blade to slice the canvas top to bottom and half step inside.
"It was only those 2. We are clear."
An announcement that did little to soften Jahara's rage.
"By the stones of, Frithha, are you mad? What in hells are you doing?"
Frithha could not tell her. She could barely hold the words in her mind, let alone speak them. She was trembling again, breathing quick and hands still clenched about the bloody knife as the final spasms of ecstasy coursed through her body. The power she had felt, to hold someone's life and death in her hand, to judge and deal out retribution as though she was born to it. She had never before enjoyed the killing, but then she had never wanted it more than at that searing instant. The rush was fading now, the come down leaving her jittery and scared to look inside and analyze what was left in its wake. The horrified anger in Jahara's eyes had Frithha suspecting she would not like what she found, and rather than face it, she pushed quickly after Valigar into the tent. Inside, a tableau greeted her, those within the pavilion still frozen mid-action by the surprise of the killings. A few women, bruised and terrified, were standing in amongst the 2 rows of tables of what looked to be the mess tent preparing vegetables and kneading dough, one woman trembling behind a large cauldron of soup that was likely to be the evening meal.
"Stay calm,"
assured Valigar, in his deep baritone that belied the tension in his jaw, Minsk and Jahara fanning out at his back.
"We are here to help you." "Where?"
He had no chance to finish his question. At the other end of the tent, a shaft of sunlight heralded the ill-fated entrance.
"Here, Megharine, you, who?"
For a moment, the 3 sides watched each other in stunned silence. The murk broke first.
"Men! Rally!"
The plangent clang of a sturdy iron pot felled the man in one good swing, the mousy middle-aged woman behind him looking more victim than the victor as she gazed down at his supine form.
"Good work,"
nodded Frithha, at his side an instant later and crouched over him. She glanced up to the woman, dagger handle proffered to her.
"You want to do it?"
The woman shook her head, petrified and hugging the pot to her chest like it could shield her from the disbelief of what she had managed. Frithha shrugged and cut his throat, the girl easing herself onto her feet once more to address the remaining women.
Right, there should be enough weapons on the bodies. Arm yourself and wait here until things quieten down. If any confront you, escape through the back into the forest.
Jahara had done half the work for them, the druid straightening from the last body to hand out the collection of swords and daggers she had looted. The gathering captives took the proffered arms with varying degrees of reluctance.
Hide these. We will remove the bodies. Pretend all is well until you have a chance to escape. Captain, we...
None were there to stop him that time, the young mercenary hardly letting the flap close behind before he was darting back through it again, his bellow exploding over the camp outside.
Alarm! The slaves are escaping!
Fritha was already charging after him, dagger sheathed and sword drawn.
Fuck! You go!
She yelled back to the women.
Escape through the forest! My lot, attack!
Imoen paused before a narrow window, the din outside faint through the mullioned pane that looked over the forest they had just traversed. Somewhere outside of view, men were shouting, the clash of arms sounding tinny and trivial from that distance.
The distraction? It's not time yet.
Above her, Solafane was already set out again and taking 2 steps at a time.
The others must have been discovered. Come on!
Somewhere above them, a door slammed, the sound of footsteps thudding closer on the soft carpet. Solafane paused, pressed to the wall before the landing just above them and waiting for them to round the corner. The 2 drow saw Imoen first, just stood in the center of the stairs, and one died with the look of confusion still on his face. Solafane's dagger flicked across his throat. The other did manage to draw his blade, though it did him little good against the green bolt of energy that hit him square in the chest, Solafane finishing the drow as he lay prone on the floor.
Sendai's bodyguards,
the man concluded, giving one of the bodies a nudge with his toe to show her the intricate pattern of weaved serpents that had been tooled into the black leather pauldron.
Sendai likely dispatched them to investigate the disturbance outside. At least it'll be easier when we get to her.
The final landing was just up the next flight, the simple wooden door rising into view with every step. Solafane led the approach, creeping cautiously up to the door, though Imoen doubted such stealth was necessary. From the sounds coming clear through the wood, Sendai was more than occupied, her voice deeper than Imoen had been expecting.
How did you escape, worm? Please, mistress, I don't.
His own scream cut him off, the cries ebbing and falling in a piteous song. Solafane glanced to her. Imoen nodded once, feeling the magic begin to warm in the base of her spine, controlled this time. She did not want another thine gate.
I will not ask again. How did you?
Solafane kicked the door wide, the room suddenly opened before them. The woman Imoen assumed was Sendai was standing in the center, a short, rather stocky-looking half-drow with cropped white hair and narrow red eyes, little of her dusky skin to be seen beneath the ornate black leather armor. She was holding a glowing rod before the grey gnome who was suspended between 2 drow bodyguards, all 4 whipping about at their sudden entrance.
What?
Imoen did not leave her time to finish the spell she was already casting, tearing through the ornately carved ceiling panels, a fracture through the multiverse to that fiery plane beyond. As one, the guards dropped the gnome, blades streaking from their scabbards as their prisoner scrabbled for the doors. Imoen hardly noticed him pass her, all her focus on her spell. Sendai had danced back, eyes fixed upon the growing tear, a hand raised as she muttered something in her own tongue, and Imoen was swallowed by overwhelming dread as the portal she was fighting to maintain slowly closed. Sendai turned to them and smiled broadly.
You think you are the only spellcrafter here, Magling? Kill them!
Solafane stepped up to meet the 2 guards, his blade a blur as he parried and countered their attacks. Imoen raised her hands, sending the scorching bolt of light ricocheting back into the room with a hasty barrier. Sendai was laughing at her clumsy casting as the woman readied another and, for a time, blade caught blade and spell countered spell as the paired duels continued. But slowly the tide was turning. One of the guards was wounded now, a slash to the throat taking him down. Imoen was barely aware of it, nor of the sweat that beaded her forehead, her body a conduit for a limitless power she was fighting to control and weave into her next spell. Sendai was no longer smiling, the frown of concentration as she struggled to hold back the crackling arc of energy spurring Imoen on. They could do this, they would. A blur behind her and her spell redirected an instant later to vaporize the drow at her back, his three brothers still charging up the stairs with blades drawn. Unchecked, Sendai was preparing her last with a look of wild elation. Solafane reassessed the odds and made his decision. A deft kick sent the guard before him staggering back and Imoen was suddenly knocked flat against the wall, the warrior shoving her to one side of the narrow landing as he rushed the three drow to the other.
Imoen, run!
And she did. Fritha ducked the axe swing, stabbing under the man's unbuckled cuirass which had been clearly donned in haste.
Get down!
Her knees buckled before she had even registered Jahara's command, the merc behind brought to the ground with a sweep to his legs. A crack to his skull ensured he did not rise again. Across the camp, tents had been trampled in the chaos, mercs laid dead halfway into their armor or fleeing the flames that were tearing through second pavilion where a small fire had got out of control in the initial confusion as their five had cut that first swathe through the unprepared troops. They were pushing back now though, the mercenaries falling back on their training and their superior numbers. Valigar had his shield, as did Inomen. The pair stood either side of Minsk and leaving the man free to swing his blade at all within range. But it was not enough, the rallying numbers of mercs pressing them in, trying to hem their group against the spreading fires. Fritha lost another step, forced back a pace to dodge the mace that swung for her head. Inomen caught the next blow on his shield though it left his flank exposed, Fritha lunging to parry the blade that would skewer him when an explosion of blinding light ripped across the lines before her to send the mercs sprawling. Imoen was tearing across the clearing in the shockwave's wake. She was alone.
Come on,
the girl yelled, hand at Valigar's arm and dragging him after her,
before they regroup.
Fritha grabbed her free arm, whipping Imoen back to her.
Where is Solafane?
Nearby, men were staggering to their feet. Inomen looked set to throw Fritha over his shoulder and give her no choice in the matter.
Fritha, we have to go. Now.
That suffocating weight of leadership, all about her paused, silently demanding her decision.
Fuck. Fall back, I'll retreat.
Minsk had the lead, pounding through the trees and Fritha looked at nothing but the fleeing figure of Jahara before her for the whole time they ran, undergrowth whipping her legs and lungs screaming. The land was sloping downward now and, ahead of her, she saw Minsk pause, the man taking a further step to disappear completely. Another of the streams that hatched the forest had cut a narrow gorge through the earth there, though its course was little more than a trickle then, the group dropping one by one to stand, bent double and panting, in the muddy bed. Imoen was beside Valigar, the man stroking her hair as she sobbed quietly into her hand. Fritha's chest was heaving, but it was not from the run, the fury she had been forced to rein in now quivering through her.
You!
She growled, voice rising to a roar as she hurled a finger at the girl with the accusation,
You left him. I had no choice.
Imoen cried, dashing the tears away with an angry hand.
Sendai is a mage, she closed the portal I tried to open. Solafane told me to run. And you did. I was a fool to trust you with this. We could have taken her, but we ran out of time and more guards arrived, we were overwhelmed. It's not our fault you were discovered in the camp.
Silence. Frithha was shaking, the truth she wanted to forget, to strike from the memory of time itself voiced by a reluctant Minsk.
We were not discovered, young Imoen. Frithha killed a guard and brought battle to us.
Imoen seemed to swell, blotchy face flushed in her sudden indignation.
You. This is your fault.
Frithha just held back from flying at the girl. The blood was screaming, anger blazing through her mind in a maddening fog.
It is. I should have gone, I told you. I told all of you. Ignorant wretches, you know nothing of this. The fates want me. I was to take Sendai, I will murder all who stand before me. This forest will drown in blood and death end.
Two hands grabbed her shoulders, pulling her about, wide hazel eyes suddenly but inches from her face.
Frithha,
gasped Jahara, the terror in her voice cutting through the haze.
Where are you?
Frithha tore away from her, rage suddenly inward, her head cradled and body curled in upon itself with that wretched moan of despair.
You can't understand, the anger, and now, he is lost. We will find him, Frithha
the woman assured.
We will rescue Solafane. Is it likely he still lives?
Asked Valigar to the agonizing silence.
He's alive. Sola, shush. Frithha.
Frithha silenced Jahara with a look, head jerked suddenly to the bushes above them. Something was there, she could feel it. She eased herself up onto her toes, something of the hunter about her as she prowled towards the bank to stand there, poised and waiting. Her arm snatched out, and something above them squealed in terror, Frithha dragging the bundle of grey and brown from the bushes to dump it at their feet, and the group looked down upon the bedraggled form of a Hessian-clothed, grey-skinned deep gnome.
A Svirfneblin!
Breathed Jahara.
The gnome from the temple,
offered Imoen, adding for the others,
the one Sendai was torturing.
Speak, snapped Frithha. The gnome seemed used to taking orders.
I was looking for you,
he barked promptly,
the ones who stormed the temple. Were you followed?
Asked Jahara, scanning the woods above. The gnome hastily shook his head.
No, most certainly not. My people are known for their stealth.
A wary glance to Frithha.
I am surprised you heard me. Well, I did. Why are you here?
His bald head shifted with a cherry frown.
I came to help you. Help us. Yes. I am Fendel, a slave, first for House Malphane and then taken by Sendai with others when she first left her house in bloody ruins and hid herself outside Dareth, the city of her birth, gathering her army within the wastelands of the Underdark. My people have always worked with the stone and are skilled masons. She used me and other Svirfneblin taken to repair the temple here. We drew up the designs, we know the traps she plans, the hidden passages, the fortifications, and we know, once it is finished, she will kill us to keep the knowledge safe. That is why I escaped, though I did not get far before I was caught.
Frithha glared down at him.
And you would risk your freedom again to help us? Why? You do not understand, I never wished to escape up here. I want to return home, to my clan in the Underdark. But I will not do it alone. All the Svirfneblin she holds should be freed. She holds them at the temple?
Asked a gnomon. Fendel shook his dusky head.
No, underground. As your kind built a fortress up here to guard this bridge between our worlds, so the Duergar who first found this place built one beneath the ground. Below the earth here, a great fissure runs, as wide as the temple clearing and miles deep, right down to the Underdark. The Duergar built a fortress just below the surface, a staging platform for any raid upon your lands. It is there Sendai keeps her main army and it is where she will have taken your friend. I will help you inside, if you will then aid the rescue of my people.
Fendel started as Fritha's hand shot out to him, though it did not grab him this time, the palm held to the side before his quivering chest.
Deal.
They shook on it, the gnome taking his hand back to gaze at it as thought he was no longer sure whether he could trust the limb. Fritha cared little to assuage his suspicions.
Now how do we get inside? Before I left, I noted the mercenaries falling back to the quarry to guard Sendai's back. They are well dug in now and will not be routed by your few numbers. But they do not know that it was never the fissure there that the temple was guarding. That fracture was made much later and hollowed out by the need for stone. The first entrance it is warded and fortified in the basement of the temple itself. It is through there Sendai and her bodyguards will have fled, and it is through there we can follow her.
Fritha straightened. She needed no more plan than that. The blood was calling, pulling her forward, but she ignored it. It was not for Sendai she would brave the darkness.
Come. We go now.
Strong hands gripped him under the arms, the two human warriors either side of him working as one to drag him along the dark stone corridor. Solafane knew better than to struggle, there would be little point then and it was better they believed him still unconscious, his body limp and mind sharp as he tried to take in all he could of his surroundings. The walls about him were granite, they were no longer in the temple, something about the cool damp of the air stirring memories, and it was as they passed a narrow window aperture that opened upon the utter blackness beyond that he confirmed it, he was underground. They made a brisk pace along a few more corridors, their three suddenly before a stout door and he was thrown inside a small stone cell. His head was throbbing where the blow had brought him unconscious, the cold walls pleasant against his forehead. That they had not killed him on sight was a good sign. Sendai wanted something and, for his part, he just needed to keep her interest until the others reached him. He knew they were coming, it was tactically unsound, even suicidal, but wherever he was now, they would be attempting a rescue or die trying, and if they were to die, then he was not sure he wished to survive either. He did not know how long he sat there, alone in the darkness. He knew what was coming, though, and used the time to prepare accordingly, the fluttering fear quashed and his fate accepted. There would be torture and he would endure. The rattle of the lock started him and he was upright again, dragged to his feet by the same two men and hauled roughly into the next room. The sudden light hurt his eyes. It was a decent-sized chamber and likely kept for only one purpose, the few lamps throwing a warm yellow light upon the large wooden frame that rose in the center, iron shackles hanging eloquently from the upper corners. To the right, shelves of bottles glittered in the glow of a smoke-blackened brazier, a rainbow of venoms and acids within. On the table opposite, a small collection of pokers and brands had been arranged, a more extensive collection of knives lined similarly at the other end next to a large wooden board set with iron spikes. Sendai was stood beside the table, idly examining a narrow blade, the woman glancing up with a staged smile as they entered.
Ah, good. Put him on the rack.
The men did as instructed. Solafane did not struggle, he made no sound at all. The frame seemed to be built for taller men than him, or perhaps that was the idea, and with his arms pulled above his head to the shackles, his toes only just brushed the stone flags. His calves were already beginning to ache, his chest and stomach feeling unnervingly exposed in that position. Sendai stepped forward, the two guards flanking her, the beaming smile made her look almost attractive. Her hand caught him sharply across the face, only to smooth down his abdomen in a lingering caress that felt close enough to foreplay to make his stomach lurch.
"So, what have we here?"
she purred, drawing out her pleasure with the needless question.
"An assassin? Speak."
Cellophane knew the answer expected of him. He did not disappoint. The gobbet of spit and blood hit the nearest guard full in the face. It was a calculated strike. Any move against Sendai would have meant instant death, and interrogation was as much an art for the captive as the torturer. His rescue was coming, of that he was sure. He just needed to keep himself alive until they arrived. His insolence had the desired effect, pain exploding through this jaw as the fist caught him. Cellophane held his breath, the force of the next few blows enough to crack a rib until, at last, Sendai nodded once and the guard moved back to leave him battered and breathless. The woman smiled.
"Who sent you?" "The matron mothers,"
Cellophane panted. His lip was split and it hurt to form the words.
"The matrons!"
Sendai exclaimed, suddenly all excitement. Their involvement, it seemed, was expected.
"Who? Which of the bitches dared to raise a blade against me?" "All. All. They are united in their hatred for the half-blood upstart."
A cruel hand spattered more blood from his mouth across the shoulder of his tunic.
"They will kneel before me."
Cellophane bloodied his own chin with a derisive snort.
"They will never kneel before you, surfacer."
But Sendai merely laughed.
"No, and their arrogance will see them dead. And yet they seem to have swallowed their pride in other matters."
She considered airily.
"After all, they sent a surfacer to stop me. You think I do not note your clothes? Your manner? You are no true drow."
Cellophane feigned outrage at the suggestion.
"I am more drow than you. The matrons knew I had spent time upon the surface, my skills were needed to find you. And time enough to make allies up here, as well. The guards noted her, your human aid. What would the matrons think, finding you working with the surfacer filth? She is my slave." "You told her to run."
Sendai's face twisted with a sneer.
"How noble, or perhaps there are others she seeks to inform. Perhaps so they may come and finish your failure."
Dull red eyes considered him coldly.
"Who are the matrons who orchestrated this? From which city do they strike?"
He raised his bloody chin to her.
"I will tell you nothing."
A nod to the guards, and for a time there was nothing more to focus upon than the pain, blows racking his aching body. The aftershocks left him trembling even as the men stepped back, his throbbing jaw suddenly snatched in the steel grip of blood-slick fingers, that broad, unsculpted face but an inch from his end filling his vision, though he did not need to see it to recognize the burning prick of the dagger at his throat.
"Speak now or die."
Cellophane could not help a smile. The first round was over.
"Tispana,"
he choked, feeling the blood gurgling up with the words,
"Jalad, ul." "Who? I do not know." "They are of Ustnatha. Have you not heard? All the Underdark seeks the glory of dispatching the half-blood bitch." "Impudent."
She drew back and struck him herself in her anger.
"Continue to torture him. You will talk."
Sendai left him with another slap and the two men stepped forward once more. Cellophane closed his eyes and settled it in his mind, the mantra to his lady that would see him through the next hour. Isla Stray, she who dances, Our Lady of the Moon, grant me your light in the darkness. End of chapter.